And welcome. It's so great to see so many people here for an important topic. If we've not met, I'm Kevin Roberts, CEO of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and it is always a pleasure to see people in this theater, I think one of the great spaces in all of Austin. And it's especially great to see all of you here, given what we've endured as a state and a country over the last 15 months. But secondly, because this topic that we're going to cover in depth tonight is one of the most pressing issues in all of the country, not just for conservatives, not just for liberals, for anyone in the United States. And I would argue, given how important the United States is for the world and how important Texas is to the United States, that this topic is perhaps the most important that we could be discussing tonight. And that's really saying something considering what's going on 2 blocks north at the Texas Capitol, which I believe, or inside of which I believe is happening a historic session. We'll know that in 6 weeks. You know, the way legislation works is, and as I was telling some legislator friends upstairs, the way legislators work is that sometimes what looks very promising ends up being less so. So over the next 6 weeks, at least here at the foundation, which focuses on state-based reform, that's what we're going to be doing. It's my job to welcome you, and also same equal privilege to introduce a truly great friend of mine and my family's, someone who has been instrumental in the work of not just conservatives, but of Texans and Americans generally. It is just a great pleasure to know that after a couple of years of trying to persuade Dr. Kevin Stewart and his board, and there were other people doing that, I'm not trying to take credit for this, Kevin, that the Austin Institute needed to get involved in public policy because our legislator friends and their staff were just pleading for additional groups to do so, that they're doing that this session. And I think one of the reasons that the legislative session will be historic is because of the great work of Kevin and all of the staff at the Austin Institute. If you have not met Dr. Kevin Stewart, you need to do so soon. He's one of the great guys in this line of work, always cheerful, which does not mean that he's Pollyannish about the present or the future. But I'm also happy to say he's a fellow Longhorn. He finished his doctorate in law and political philosophy at the University of Texas. I'm a native Louisianan and not an LSU fan, so I'm sorry to say he's also an alum of the Louisiana State University. That strike against him aside, I think that Kevin is one of the most thoughtful, articulate people I know on this topic, and others. I could say that too about my good friend and colleague Josh Trevino, but Kevin has the great privilege of introducing him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Stewart.
Good evening. Another person named Kevin. You can probably see this band. This does not mean that I went out clubbing before coming here tonight. It's what's required to get in the Capitol these days. You have to either get a COVID test or prove that you've been vaccinated. Thank you all for being here. This, as Kevin Roberts said, this is a really important discussion. So Latinos are very important to conservatism and the future of conservatism. And if you're wondering what's the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture doing here, co-sponsoring this event, it's because obviously the way that Latinos have influenced American culture already and will in the future has a great nexus and great overlap with issues affecting the family. And so we care about this issue a whole lot. And so we're really excited to have this group of three who know a lot more about the issue than I do speaking about it. So I'm going to be quiet very soon so that we can get to what really matters. But I want to say briefly, if you've never heard of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, we are a social sciences research institute based here in Austin. So we have scholars, fellows, senior fellows across social science disciplines, including political science, psychology, sociology, economics, and law. In fact, we have one of them here tonight. The middle speaker, Dr. Ashleen Menchaca-Bagnulo, is one of our fellows, and we're very proud to have her here tonight. So take her as an example of the great work that many of our scholars are doing. And our job at the Institute is first and foremost to support their work, because we need good, high-quality, rigorous research that isn't anti-family, that is in fact from a standpoint that believes in the importance of the family. And then second, we have to translate that work to bring it from the ivory tower down to the public square. And that's what, as Dr. Roberts was alluding to, I spend a lot of my time doing. So with that, I'd be glad to talk to anybody afterwards, but we'll for now introduce the man who will run the show for the rest of the evening. Josh Trevino is the Chief Innovation Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, in which he explores pathways for future foundation action and develops forecasts for Texas and the nation. Prior to his service as CIO, he was Vice President for Strategy at the Illinois Policy Institute in Chicago. Prior to that, he was Vice President for Communications at TPPF for 6 years. His other experience includes service as Vice President for Policy at the Pacific Research Institute in San Francisco, independent media consultancy, consultancy at Booz Allen Hamilton, service as both a speechwriter and an international health professional in the administration of George W. Bush, and service as a United States Army officer. He lives in Austin, Texas, or in the region, with his wife and 2 really great kids, whom I've had the pleasure to meet recently. Josh?
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks to both the Kevins. I hate hearing my my bio because it sounds like I can't hold down a job. So thank you all for coming here. I agree this is a very important topic. In summer 2017, the school teacher in the small South Texas town of Cotulla closed up for good his one-room schoolhouse. But before leaving, the teacher, a young man named Jose de la Luz Saints, left this note on the door of the schoolhouse. "My dear students," he wrote, "this is definitely our last day of school. Next Monday at 11 in the morning, I will become part of the militia that will defend our country." He was volunteering to serve in the First World War. "Until now, I have used pencil and pen to wage trying battles for the educational advancement of our people. You will soon hear that I am holding a rifle in the trenches of France, upholding our people's pride for the glory and honor of our flag. I am not going on an excursion. I know that the life that awaits me will be difficult, the most demanding that I will have experienced, but I do not think it will be as difficult as Washington's crossing of the Delaware or his stay at Valley Forge. If it becomes just as difficult, so much the better. It will be a greater honor for our people. Viva Washington! Viva the Star-Spangled Banner, and viva nuestra raza." Jose de la Luz Saints returned from his service on the Western Front in the First World War to become a co-founder of the League of United Latin American Citizens. So, the question of the place of Hispanics, Tejanos, Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Dominican Americans, everything that falls into the banner of Latino, which terminology we will discuss shortly, has been a live issue in American civics for a very long time, and it continues to be. And I would argue that perhaps no time in our history has it been as compelling as it is now. Here with me to discuss this incredibly important issue are 2 very distinguished minds, and there are only 2 distinguished minds on this stage. They're sitting to my left. One, very pleased to be joined by Dr. Ashleen Menchaca-Bagnulo, an assistant professor of political science at Texas State University. Dr. Menchaca-Bagnulo has taught at Princeton, the Naval Academy, the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, and my own alma mater, Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. She studies the civic Republican tradition and topics of race, women, and religion, published in multiple eminent journals, contributed regularly to public discourse, and you're a media figure too, America Magazine, NBC Latino, SiriusXM's America This Week. You're originally from South Central Texas, and you currently live in New Braunfels. Good choice. To her left is the distinguished Alfonso Aguilar. Sir, thank you for joining us. The president of the Latino Partnership for Conservative Principles, a Washington, D.C.-based advocacy group which promotes conservative values and ideals within the Latino community and works to integrate Latinos into fuller and more active participation and leadership in the conservative movement. Mr. Aguilar is also president of the International Human Rights Group, a nonprofit legal foundation accredited before the OAS that seeks to defend political rights, religious freedom, and the dignity of the human person. You're also an advisor to the Holy See's mission to the OAS. I did not know that. That's outstanding. And has been a member of the Vatican's delegation to the most recent General Assemblies of the OAS. Former chief of the Office of U.S. Citizenship in the administration of President George W. Bush. That probably means we went to the same White House Cinco de Mayo together, which means you're in the group photo. I need to go back and find you. I remember it vividly because President Bush shook my hand and gave me a look and a wink, and he said, "You know, this is for Hispanics, right?" But of course, unlike most times when I get that comment, he was joking. Well-known policy and political analyst and regularly quoted in media around the world. So please join me with a welcoming round of applause for our two panelists here. Thank you so much. Dr. Menchaca-Bagnulo, I'd like to start with you, and this is a free-form conversation, by the way. So it'll be the three of us, mostly the two of them. I'll facilitate, and then afterwards we are going to have Q&A. There will be time for that. So please save your questions to the end, but also generate questions too as you listen. I'd like to start with you. Tell me a little bit about the extent to which the concept of a distinct Latino, even if that term is even accurate or appropriate, Latino cohort exists within American civic life. How far do we take that?
That's a great question. So I would come at it from two angles, and one angle would be to come at it from a sort of historical nation-building angle, and the other would be to come at it from a social science angle. So I'm not Amy Comey Barrett, so I don't remember numbers or statistics. So I brought some, and I think it's important to point out some differences in Latinos. So in Florida, for example, 50% of Latinos voted for Trump. And then in Arizona, you have 6 and 10 for Biden, and you have 56% of Latinos voting in Nevada for Biden. In Texas, Biden won the Latino vote, but Starr County, which is 96% Latino, voted for Trump, and that was a huge surprise to people who are following the sort of demographic behavior of the nation. And I read a really interesting article in preparation for this that was called, he said, Trump didn't win the Latino vote, he won the Tejano vote. And I thought that was a very interesting distinction, because for me, I'm a Tejana, and I guess, you know, to see that in the national stage, that word was huge. You don't often see that distinction made. And I thought that was a big step for us, noticing that there is going to be a difference between Tejanos, Cubans, Mexican Americans who are settling in Nevada, for example, are going to be very represented in the hospitality industry. And so their votes will follow sort of the union for that industry. And I think people who are careful will notice all of these distinctions, right, between not only Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, and Cubans, but between even within those groups, those differences that exist. And one of the things I think that the Biden camp has sort of seen in autopsy is that they failed to really appreciate those distinctions. Now, from a historical angle, I would say one of the things that is significant, for me at least, especially as we begin to talk about nationalism more, is to emphasize the role that Latinos have in the nation, just organically. A lot of times we are discussed as if we have arrived, but we didn't arrive. A lot of us have been here before it became a nation. We were a part of Mexico, and some, I mean, you could go back further. We were in indigenous groups. And so I think one of the things I notice, just in the general sort of American discourse, left and right, is to speak about Latinos like they're an add-on to the American project, or this is something new. But what I'm hoping is that as we are sort of recognizing the distinctions, that we also look at the history and see the influence that we've had.
Alfonso, your thoughts?
I totally agree. Look, I think the Democrats realized in this last election that Latinos are really not monolithic. You know, they've always said, oh no, we recognize that the Hispanic community is very diverse, but then they go on to say, but they have the same views on the issues. Always do that. And that's just not right. Latinos are very diverse, not only in terms of countries of origin, how long they've been in the United States. If you look at Mexican Americans, those who are multi-generational Mexicans, we took over half of Mexico's territory, and they've been here always. And then we have some that arrived during the Bracero program, and they stayed here. Puerto Ricans, the same thing. We have those who've arrived recently, have gone mainly to Central Florida. They become a political force in Central Florida. Puerto Ricans are now, they have actually in numbers surpassed the Cuban American community in Florida. So, and they're citizens. So they arrive and they immediately become a political force in Florida. So different countries of origin, socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think in this election, we saw that the Hispanic community is also, as voters, becoming more sophisticated. Whereas generally, yes, the majority voted for Democrats, I think Democrats are starting to realize that many Hispanics were starting to say or show that they were independent. First of all, Hispanic conservatives, who in the past, they were ideologically conservative, but still voted for the Democrats because they felt that's the party of Hispanics, or they have a better tone regarding Hispanics. In this election, they said, wait a second, I'm pro-life, I believe in religious freedom, I don't want government in my life. I'm actually going to vote for the Republican candidate. So we saw Hispanic conservatives finally saying, I'm going to vote for the conservative candidate. But then we also saw another interesting thing, and I think is seeing Hispanics as swing voters. Hispanics that may not be conservative, but saying, you know what? The policies that Trump is proposing on the economy, the economic populism focus on the middle class, do work. We've seen unemployment go dramatically down for Hispanics, but not only unemployment, wages going up, people getting out of poverty in historic numbers. So they said, I'm going to vote for that. It really is helping my community. So we have seen the Hispanic community, I think, begin to behave more like average voters. Perhaps Hispanics are beginning to assimilate as the immigrants from 100 years ago, the Italians, the so-called white ethnics. We always have to give a silly label to groups. The white ethnics, the Italians, the Polish. Well, perhaps Hispanics are starting to assimilate and are starting to show patterns that are similar to the average voter. In that sense, I think Democrats are very scared because their belief has always been, as long as the Hispanic electorate grows, we'll control national politics and state politics. But what we're seeing here is that in the short term, that may be true. But as the Hispanic community grows and becomes more sophisticated, they're actually willing to look at Republicans and say, and support them either because they're conservative or because they like their proposals. So that, I think, gives hope to the conservative movement. And frankly, this conversation is important because the only way the conservative movement can grow is if more Hispanics support the conservative movement. And I think Ronald Reagan understood this. Ronald Reagan had a great way of just, in very simple words, putting things in the right context. And he used to say, Hispanics are Republican. They just don't know it. And he didn't mean that in a condescending way. I think he meant that if we engage them with a conservative message, they are going to respond well, but with a fully conservative message. And that means really talking about the issues in a way that resonates. It's not enough to say, the years of Viva Bush and here are the mariachis, and that's over. You have to persuade with ideas. And I think if we do that, we can certainly grow the Hispanic movement and get more Hispanics to vote for Republican candidates.
I want to drill down on this a little bit more because, of course, the commonplace of Hispanic communities, whether they're Tejano or almost any other national origin, and that is the point of real social division within the Hispanic cohort is the national origin division. But this commonplace that they are a fundamentally conservative community, and we've probably seen it in our own lives. People who go to church, they own trucks that are too large. The most ridiculous belt buckles were worn by my grandfather, and yet a diehard Democratic electorate for years and years. Basically, with two exceptions. One with the, I believe, the 2000 performance with George W. Bush, and then with the 2020 performance with President Trump, particularly in South Texas. And by the way, I agree that more a Tejano phenomenon than anything else. So I want to pitch this first to you, Dr. Menchaca-Bagnulo, but I'm interested in both of your opinions. Are the 2000 and 2020 overperformances versus the historical norm? Are they for the same cause? And if not, is 2020 going to be sustainable in a way that 2000 was not? What do you think?
That's a really good question. So I guess I'd start off by saying that there is this sort of natural conservatism to Latino culture generally, even if you sort of draw back from the country of origin divisions and you look at it statistically. We are more religiously observant than the general population. We are, I think, the only racial or ethnic demographic that is against abortion's legality. So there are sort of these affinities, and I think from a sociological perspective, we're very familial. We tend to have strong gender norms, even if there is some amount of gender equality. And so you can see why there's this sort of natural fit. One of the things that I'm concerned about, or I guess I would, from a strategic perspective, say, is that I don't know if it's sustainable, because in order for it to be sustainable, you have to be capturing the younger generation of Latinos. And statistically, their numbers of religiosity are dropping. Latinos are interesting because I think on the whole, they think gay marriage it should be legal, but they don't agree with it. In the younger cohort, they agree with it and think it should be legal. So there are some important differences. One of the things that as somebody who teaches a lot of young Latinos, because I'm at a Hispanic serving institution, is that I worry that you might see a similar phenomena that we saw happen with American Muslims who began to migrate toward the Democratic Party, even though they have all of these cultural affinities with conservatism. That happened around the time that we had a lot of the rhetoric around 9/11 about Muslims. Muslims they can't be Americans, they're a threat, da 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 da. The younger generation of Muslims sort of began to distance themselves from what you might think would be their more natural orientation. And it won't be sustainable, I think, if you aren't able to capture the younger generation. And so there are two problems that I pointed out. The first being the problem of their declining religiosity, and the second being the problem of the reaction to rhetoric. But I think one of the things that you saw in the last election that was unique and that I think you can trade on for the future is that one of the strengths of the Trump campaign was to be on the ground and to reach out to particular communities, including Latino communities, and then to get them active. And then they get their friends involved. So, like, true confessions, I didn't like Trump. But my my family in the valley.
That's a majority opinion nationally, just FYI.
My family in the valley, for the most part, they, some of them could not stand him, but I had relatives that were going to like the Trump trains and stuff, and to his talk at the border. They were super into it. They'd never been into anything that much in their lives. And their network was activated. And that's something that I mean, nobody is coming to a Biden train. So you have to tap into what was it about the community organizing? What was it about the approach that worked in 2020? And I would move in that direction. And then I would, when it comes to the young voters, I would pull back. Like, don't have the Anglo-Saxon caucus that MTG wanted to have in Congress, okay? Bad idea right now. If you're gonna grow your numbers, don't do that. So those would be sort of my two recommendations of how to make it sustainable. But it all depends on who gets the ball.
Thanks. I'll just add to that. My father, who I guess kind of on paper, if you didn't know him, was a career Air Force officer. Unlike me, looks Mexican. So my dad and I look alike, but I'm like the yellow Labrador Retriever, and he's the chocolate-colored one. But effectively the same person if you take a black and white photo. But he actually experienced as a Mexican American young man in South Texas, like real. I've never experienced it, but real racial discrimination when he was growing up in various forms. And so on paper, you'd think he'd be a guy who would react to if you kind of believe the media narrative to the rise of Trump with some horror. Completely wrong. Late 2015 on the Trump train, exactly to your point, and rode it all the way through to last January. So again, there's something happening there. Mr. Aguilar, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, that's a very interesting comparison, and I must say that I was part of the two efforts in 2000 and now in 2020. So I guess I'm dating myself. And some people here actually were very active in 2000 in the Bush effort. I see Massey Villarreal over there. He was the head of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. He was very involved. Even Rafa Bejar, I think, was very involved at the RNC. Look, I don't think, in terms of engagement, I think President Bush in 2000, I never seen a campaign with such a sophisticated outreach effort towards Hispanics. Every single press release came out in English and Spanish. The Bush campaign was everywhere in Spanish language media. They understood the different constituencies. I think it was the success, yes, of ideas, but really of engagement, really running a very good campaign towards Hispanic voters. I think the effort in 2020 from President Trump was different. I don't think any campaign is going to top what President Bush did in 2000 or even 2004, which was just really incredible in terms of really trying hard to engage Hispanic voters. I think the Trump campaign had an effort, and I think it was pretty good. But I think the difference is that I, at the end, think that, first of all, the Hispanic voter in 20 years has changed. As I've said, I think it's more sophisticated. And I think what we saw in this last election is President Trump being able to win over voters through persuasion. So while Bush was effective through engagement, Trump was really effective through persuasion. So that explains why you had people who did like the tone and said, he really said that. I don't like that comment about, the Mexicans coming here. But then looking at the policies, they would say, these are good policies. I'm going to vote for this guy. So that shows us a voter that's more sophisticated, that can say his personality, the way he sometimes refers to opponents, I don't like that, is childish, whatever. But when we came to the policies, I think people said, we like what he stands for. And I think it's a turning point in terms of Hispanic politics, where it's not only about engagement, it is about ideas. And Trump didn't shy about, first of all, with economic populist message. The Republican Party had fallen trap, I think, to to corporate interests. We had a candidate, Mitt Romney, who I remember the Tampa, the Republican convention in Tampa, where an entire day was dedicated to small business owners. And I love small business owners. Hispanics are small business owners. They're creating small businesses 3 times as fast as the national average. But you know what? Like the majority of Americans, Hispanics are employees, not entrepreneurs. So President Trump was able to engage Hispanic, all workers. And in fact, his economic populist message caught across different constituencies, African Americans, Hispanics. And he did, I think, very well. On the issue of life, on the issue of freedom of religion, which is so important for Hispanics, he really connected with the Hispanic community. He was strong in his policies during the 4 years, and people were impressed by that. So I think that is the difference. I think it's sustainable if we continue that path of standing on policy, on issues, if we don't water down our conservative values and message. In terms of young voters, I think that really cuts across all constituencies, because that's a challenge that as conservatives we have. However, with Hispanic youngsters, it's very interesting because a lot of them, well, first of all, if their parents are immigrants, they are probably English speakers, and they get their news not from Telemundo or Univision. They're getting their news from any English language media outlet. Often they don't want to be targeted as Hispanic. I was in Miami when Univision had just started a year before a channel to engage Hispanics in English. I forget what the name of it was.
Fusion.
Fusion. It was Fusion. So I had a meeting with Jorge Ramos. And Jorge tells me, Alfonso, it's funny as Jorge Ramos was telling me this story. I was like, hey, now you realize that. He says, we started Fusion, and it turns out that young Hispanics don't like it. They don't want to be targeted as Hispanic. Nobody wants to listen to Jorge Ramos in English. That's the truth. I mean, nobody wants to listen to Jorge Ramos, period. But the whole point is, people that listen to Hispanic media, it's not because they're looking for Hispanic television. They're listening to Hispanic media because it's in Spanish. So if you're Hispanic and you prefer English, you're going to be watching Fox or CNN or MSNBC, whatever. So I think that that's very interesting in terms of the Hispanic community, that I don't know if tone, in terms of talking about the Hispanic community, if they're really going to get offended, if they're going to buy this narrative of that the Democrats are pushing of racial tension, of victimization. I mean, I think they're pushing that with Hispanics. I don't know if Hispanic youngsters are necessarily going to buy that, but I will say that this is a challenge that we have that cuts across different constituencies. But I do believe that many are receptive to our message on the economy, especially if it's one targeted, focused on the middle class, on the working class. And I think also, I don't see Hispanics responding very well to this, the radical multiculturalist agenda. And even youngsters, that you're going to be victimized, that you're going to be the victim of racism. I think for many it is a turnoff. Now, I don't think for everyone. I think there are Hispanic communities that have fallen prey to that type of language. Certainly, in some places in California, if you in LA, as a Puerto Rican, I can tell you, Puerto Ricans in New York think of AOC. I mean, some people think AOC, all Puerto Ricans are like that. Well, I hopefully I'm not like AOC. I don't dress as well, but I don't have the money. But the whole point is that I think they just don't like this victimization. And again, their parents came here to achieve the American dream. They don't want to be singled out. This whole idea of institutional racism is something that they perhaps saw in their home country, in Mexico or Guatemala. When they come here, they see freedom and opportunities. They don't want to be told right now, you're going to be discriminated. So I think that's an area where I think that the Republican conservative message may be more appealing.
I want to ask a really long-range question. a really long-range question. So, of course, the three of us up here, Aguilar, Menchaca, Trevino, but if you didn't know us and our names were given as Smith, Jones, and Cooper, that would be plausible to all present. And this demonstrates two things. It illuminates the extent to which the Hispanic world and Hispanic community is remarkably diverse, more so than I think a lot of popular media would present. But it also illuminates another phenomenon that affects Hispanic demography in the United States, and this is the phenomenon of ethnic attrition. Now, ethnic attrition doesn't happen in the same way or at the same rate with a lot of other racial groups in particular. But among Hispanics in the United States, there's a fairly predictable three-generation pattern in which the generation one tends to be heavily identified with whatever culture of origin there is, often linguistically as well. Generation two is transitional. And then generation three tends to normalize within the broader American population. And at this point, you start to, a lot of things start to happen. The religious identification, to your point, Dr. Menchaca-Bagnulo, becomes much more diverse, and even majority Protestant in some cases. There tends to be more of a self-ID as white. The politics tend to diversify. So with all this said, and knowing that this is kind of an inexorable engine of mainstreaming, assimilation, whatever you want to call it. I don't like the word assimilation in this case because I think it implies things that aren't necessarily accurate, but let's go with it. Are we going to be having this conversation in the far future? Is there going to be a cohort to discuss?
I love this question. So I have a theory.
That's why I gave it to you first.
Thank you. So my parents are from the Valley, which is by Mexico. And so they both spoke Spanish before they speak English. And I'm not able to speak Spanish. I can understand it. I can't speak it. All my cousins are like that. My cousins haven't had, I guess, let me come in another direction. My mother left McAllen to go to college at Texas A&M. And when she got there, her mother and her uncle begged her, come back to the Valley, come back. And she did. And so she didn't leave the Valley until about 5 or 6 years later. She went to Dallas. And when she was in Dallas, everybody thought she was so Mexican. And she had not thought of herself that way before. And my father, the same. He went to a meeting where he was the head of he was the project manager. And the contractor meeting with them says, oh, you look like you just swam across the river. So they leave the Valley, and all of a sudden, their sort of experience of their identity is different. I didn't realize how much, I didn't realize the differences that I had been raised with until I went to Indiana for graduate school. And so I think one of the things that is going to be important is how are Latinos received when they go to these places where they aren't in their larger community? How do they feel that they're received? How do they think they're perceived? That's going to be a major part of the engine of political identity. And then I think what happens in places where you're surrounded by other Hispanics, like the Valley, it's easy to be conservative, I think, because you have the natural affinities and you don't have anybody telling you that you don't belong. So my theory is that it's going to all hinge on if you're told you belong or not. The experiences of racism, I think, are real, especially when you go out into places where you aren't represented in institutions. But you have a lot of Latinos who live in places where they're well represented. And I think this is going to be sort of the critical point. And so I know I've said this several times. So this might be where we disagree a little bit. I think in the long run, tone is going to matter because tone is going to trickle down to neighborhoods. Tone is going to trickle down to churches. tone is going to trickle down to schools. And if you are a Latina in McAllen, it's a different thing than my mother found than when she was a Latina in Dallas. And so that I'm worried about that.
My in-laws are from Indiana, to your point. And when I was first getting to know my wife, and it was one of the first times, it may have been the first time we went out to dinner somewhere, they wanted to know where I wanted to go, and the question made its way back to me, and I said, well, let's go get some Mexican food. And I'm not exacting in my Mexican food, by the way. I'm pretty tolerant of it. But they were worried about what I would consider, because I'm a real Mexican to them, and they were worried about it, but they wanted to take me someplace exotic, and that's how we had dinner at Olive Garden. So the Midwest is a different place. Yes. Alfonso?
Yeah, I think we disagree on this point. I do believe that, and again, the Hispanic experience is diverse, certainly. And I think there are segments of the Hispanic population that have bought into the racial identity narrative. Some, unfortunately, have also fallen trap of the entitlement culture, unfortunately, where they become dependent on entitlements, and it's very hard to get out of that cycle of poverty. Certainly, as somebody who grew up and was raised in Puerto Rico, I can tell those Puerto Ricans that left for New York in the late 40s, 50s, 60s have fallen trap into that. And it's just very difficult for them to get out of that cycle, I think. But they're surrounded by fellow Puerto Ricans, and they feel discriminated, surrounded by fellow Puerto Ricans. However, we see a lot of immigrants arriving from different parts of Latin America, Central America, Mexico, arriving here, going to different places, because now they're going everywhere. That's the other thing of the immigration experience, is they're not just going to the traditional immigration hubs. They're going wherever there's a job available. They're going to communities where there are no immigrants, but they're integrating. They're becoming part of the fabric, and they don't feel discriminated, and they're just a few, which is ironic. They may feel victims of racism when they're surrounded by many people like them, but when they're in another place where perhaps they're just only a few people from their country of origin, they really don't feel discriminated, and that they start integrating. A lot of them actually marry outside of their ethnic community, encouraging. I call it assimilation because I don't have a problem. In America, when we talk about assimilation, we're talking about patriotic assimilation. We're talking about political assimilation. It means learning English because we need a language to communicate and deliberate. We need a common set of principles, and we need a common history as well. It's a history of the family. It's not about food. It's not, the different cultural traditions. So in that respect, I think it's important that people do assimilate. So I think that a lot of Hispanics are assimilating, and I think their experience is more like, as I've said before, the experience of the so-called white ethnics, Italians and Polish. The great Martin Scorsese, talking about his family, would say, my grandfather was Italian. I'm Italian-American. My son is American of Italian origin. So I think that's already happening with a lot of Hispanics, and that will show in the voting patterns. I said something about Trump, which every time I say it, people kind of look at me like, what are you talking about? I truly believe that there was a message of total inclusion that came from Trump. Because when he talked about African Americans or Hispanics, it was all about being American. You're coming here not to be singled out. When you're in Ecuador or in Peru and they call you an Indio, to discriminate against you because you're not going to be able to start a business, much less a business that competes with Family X. But then all of a sudden you come here and they treat you as an American, not as a minority group that's going to be discriminated. People get excited about that. I tell you, and it wasn't only the Cuban community, because I know, yes, the Cuban community they went local with Trump. That is, I mean, you go to southern Florida, and that is Trump country, and they just. But he was successful in Osceola County with the Puerto Ricans. He was successful in the southern congressional districts here in Texas. Even in Maricopa County in Arizona, he did incredibly well. So I think there's something about that aspirational message of being American that Hispanics love.
I'll have to, this is going to sound like a Tom Friedman story, which is a code for saying it's going to sound like it's completely made up, but it's not. This is actually real. It's an Uber driver that I had. You can see the Tom Friedman part coming in. So this person driving me around, very nice young woman, person of color, and she had I think it was a Cuban flag, if I remember right, kind of hanging off of her dashboard. Not unusual in itself, but spoke with her a little bit. It emerged that she wasn't Cuban, she was just interested in Latin America, and all right, that's fine. So started talking, and I told her a little bit about Mexico, and her comment was, I'd love to go down there, I'd love to go someplace, go to Mexico or someplace like that, where race just isn't an issue. and I thought, oh.
And a lot of people think that way.
A lot of people do think that way. But to your point, exactly to both your points, when those who are particularly close to countries of origin, Mexico being the one that I'm familiar with, I'm not familiar with Puerto Rico, by the way, so you can correct me if I'm this. But in Mexico, it's an extremely race and caste-conscious society, to an extent that Americans would find shocking. And so there's a sense in which if you are from there, or if you're adjacent to it and you come to the United States, it's a relief to be here. And that certainly shapes civic perceptions. Let me ask you both an unfair question and pose a false dichotomy to you. Now that we've had the easy parts gone, let's say you're advising the 2024 candidate, whoever that is, the Republican nominee in this particular case, and you've got to make a choice in Hispanic outreach. You have to double down on social issues outreach or economic issues outreach. Which do you choose? Dr. Menchaca-Bagnulo?
Economic. Yeah.
Tell us why.
I think that I don't know what to say. I mean, it's foundational. Okay, so first of all, after the last election, there was a poll, and it said that 49% of Americans are 18 and above are identifying as Democrat. And only 40% are identifying as Republican. And if I were a Republican, I'd be worried about that. So then I would ask myself, what do people like about the Democrats that I can stomach? And also, what did Trump do that was reaching these new people? And I think all that is economic. It is economic populism. And I think that, so, I don't know how to say this. I think people, I still think people are offended by Trump. So like my father liked a lot of things about Trump, but he kept telling me, Trump is not racist, but there are all these racists who like him. And so he's making this distinction that I didn't think was there. And the reason I thought that was significant is because that is how he psychologically was coming to him. And the thing that was drawing him, that I think draws across the lines, like you're saying, was this idea of the worker and the family. And you're going to be able to pull from the African American community with that. You're going to be able to pull from the Latino community with that. You're going to be able to pull from the white middle class and the white lower class with that. And so I would say pursue that direction, because you're going to have a wide net. That's why I say if you want to win.
But what if you want to lose? No, I'm just kidding. So definitely on the economic side. Alfonso, what do you think?
Okay, so I'm in Florida advising the Republican candidate. So I think that and let me say something about tone. I'm not saying that tone is not important. I would say that that was perhaps the biggest problem President Trump had. You could argue that perhaps he may have lost the election because of tone. And that was not a problem only with Hispanics. It was a problem with everyone. So I think tone is important. You want to be a happy warrior. Think of Ronald Reagan. He was a happy warrior. But in terms of the policies and the vision, I think he had it right. And first you start with, I think it has to be an integrated message. It can't be just one issue. But you start with economic populism that doesn't mean we don't talk about entrepreneurs and small business owners. We have to, absolutely. But we talk about the working class. And we talk about something that Trump embraced, that I think it was a good idea. I mean, I don't love excessive, huge government, but I do believe that government does have a role. I think talking about paid family leave, for example, I would eliminate some programs that are useless and spend more money in paid family leave. That I think that was well received by many different communities. I think that, so talking about economic populism, helping the middle class, I would argue, however, that with the Hispanic community, we still have to talk about the human person and the family. And especially now, because even with some people who perhaps those issues are not the most important for them, we're living at a time, you're living it right here in Texas, where we're debating whether a transgender person should be able to play female sports. And look, that to me is a very shocking thing. And there are people who may not like to talk about those issues, but when they see something like that, they say, wait a second, you've gone too far. Because at least in the past, we had a basic understanding of the human person and the dignity of the human person. So I think right now it is the time, and Trump did it, to talk about the dignity of the human person, to talk about defending the biological scientific fact that people are born male or female. It's not religion I'm talking about. I'm talking about science, okay? So I think we have to talk about that. And we have to talk about freedom of religion and freedom of expression when we have a campaign by the left to marginalize churches and to force people to say things that go against and do things that go with their religious principles. So that has to be part of the message. And I think part of the message also has to be a defense of our American values, our free market system, and against socialism. Because we have right now a Democratic Party that is embracing socialism. And for those people who came from Latin America, they have experience with state-run economies, with government benefits that they never see. Oh, in Ecuador, we have universal health care. Yeah. I have a card that says it. So they come here because of our system of opportunities. We have to defend that. The problem that many Republicans have is that they're weak. And they're afraid of talking about this because it's going against the current. In a way, our message is countercultural. It's an integrated message. But if we do it with a constructive tone, an inspiring tone, I think we can be extremely successful. So that's the message I would say that a successful Republican candidate needs to embrace.
Hearing you speak, if I can,
No, please.
I realize that part of the reason that the economic message is so powerful, probably for the whole nation, but particularly, since we're talking about Latinos, for Latinos, is because the economic message is connected to the family. You're thinking, I'm going to preserve my family. I'm going to make a future for them. When my grandpa was dying, he died about 2 years ago. and he had been a migrant worker. They were citizens, but they would travel and pick. And so he's on hospice and he's dying, and I got to be with him for a little bit. And I said, "You did it, Grandpa, you did it." He became apprenticed to a butcher, and then he became a butcher. And then my mom became a teacher, and I became a professor. And I said, we're here, we're safe. We have health care. You know, I think that is the pull of the economic message is the family. And that's why things like family leave are appealing, but that's also why things like being against abortion are appealing.
Or school choice.
Yes.
Why do many Hispanics support school choice? Because they want to send their kids to parochial schools, which are very popular. So these are the issues. One issue that we haven't talked about, kind of like the elephant in the room, and is immigration. Because, and things have changed. 20 years ago, the debate on immigration was very different. There was a certain consensus between Democrats and Republicans. That's all gone. I think President Trump was also successful with Hispanics because during the 4 years, he didn't turn out to be the monster that the Democrats said he was going to be on immigration. If we look at statistics, think of green cards. Every year during the Trump administration, we issued 1 million green cards a year. That continued. Now, there were things like separation of families that wasn't popular. A lot of conservatives, including me, criticized that. But that policy at the end ended up, it lasted for 2 months. But Hispanics understand that there was separation of families before. When Obama deported more people than any president before, that was separation of families. There was even policy of separation of families at the border. When there was a surge of of families going to the border during the Obama years, there was a separation of families where they would separate father from mother and child. They talked about, and they had to drum up this idea that Trump was really bad on immigration, talked about the cages. Well, first of all, they were in cages. And they started it under Obama. And they were actually set up. That was fencing. When they arrive in large numbers, children are separated from adults, unaccompanied minors, because there are sexual predators. There is child trafficking. So that was actually a necessary measure. So I think on immigration, I think we need a better tone. I think we also need solutions. And during the administration, I think I did see a change where we moved from initially President Trump supporting a bill from Senator Cotton to reduce legal immigration, to then Jared Kushner's effort to move to a merit-based system without reducing legal immigration. I think that was very positive. So I think if we're constructive on the issue, but also emphatic on the importance of rule of law, which this administration has totally disregarded, I think we can win over a lot of Hispanics.
Thank you both very much. We've come to the end of the time when the three of us will talk, and we are now at the point where all of you get an opportunity to talk. My colleague Clint Nesmith has a microphone here, so if you have a question, raise your hand. But before you do, if you have a question, ask a question. And then let Clint have the microphone back. That way we can spend as much time as we need to answering the questions. Sir, you're first.
My name's Frank. I'm San Antonio. It's fine and dandy that we talk about the Hispanics or Latinos or whatever we talk about here and try to keep them and grow the conservative movement, starting with the Republican Party and then shifting up to the conservative side. But I think there's a barrier here that's keeping, I guess to ask my question is, how do you get them to stop listening to just one side of the media? Because the media controls everything, and the other side has the media under control. So how do you shift them over? How do you shift the media to start being more diverse, more informative? Or how do you get these people away from that? To me, I've always thought that's a bit of an issue.
That is a key question right there. Look, Hispanic media is controlled by two major networks. The media that most Latinos following Spanish in the United States, Univision or Telemundo. And frankly, they follow, they have a liberal bias. They tend to focus exclusively on immigration. And they tend to support, generally, the Democratic agenda. That's a fact. And that's what Hispanics are listening every single day. There are some exceptions. The Miami media market, there are many, many good conservative shows. Ironically, in this past election, Democrats, they always have to come up with a reason for explaining why they're not doing so well. They said, Trump did better with Hispanics because there was a lot of misinformation coming out of conservative Spanish language programs. So about 20 progressive organizations sent letters around to the different radio networks and local TV networks in Miami telling them to silence those conservative voices because they were lying. Voto Latino, one of the top liberal organizations nationwide, started by Eva Longoria and some other in Hollywood, actually do have a multi-million-dollar campaign to identify conservative voices in Spanish language media to silence them, because according to them, they're lying. So, which is funny, they control the media with a liberal message, and still they want to silence the few conservatives in Spanish language media. I think we need, because Spanish language media is still very important, I think something that has helped us nationally to be able to compete with Democrats and respond to that liberal narrative is that we have Fox News, that we have Newsmax, that we have OAN and other. I think we definitely need a Fox News en Español or Fox Noticias, whatever. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what the people with money are thinking, but that's a sustained effort. And that has to start right now. If you start doing conservative or Republican Spanish language programming 3 months before the election, that's just not going to work. It has to be consistent. And I don't know why we're not doing it. I think that's the key, because if not, we're going to continue with this totally biased reporting.
I'll just add one thing to the, because I agree with all that, but I think implicit in the question there is the extent to which this is media that Hispanics consume versus actual Spanish language media. And they're not, that Venn diagram overlaps, but it's not necessarily the same. There was some good, correct me if I'm wrong on this, by the way, because I think you've looked at this more recently than I have, but as of 5 years ago, there was good Pew Hispanic research indicating that there was a preference, even among primary Spanish speakers in the United States, to receive news in English. And so the media universe is largely the same as the general media universe, which does skew left. Anything to add before we go into that?
The one thing that occurs to me is just, I think there's a sort of general sense that Latinos are weird because we have this sort of conservative affinity, but then I know most of us are still voting Democratic, and we will say that's for the working man, or that's what I've heard, right? And so I think that's part of what the Trump poll was, is saying I'm for the working man or I'm for the working woman. One of the things that I think you could do as a conservative is to, like you said, have a message that is not singling you out. So like Latinx as a word, I don't think Latinos are going to consume media that uses the word Latinx. It's actually...
In fact, the more you say that word, the more votes you lose.
Yes.
Because what it means, it's just really offensive.
And it's colonizing. I mean, it's not indigenous to the language. The language has a natural sort of gender separation. And so I think you see this sort of packaged media doing things like that. The more that happens, the more they're going to be sort of put off. So that's an inroad.
But it's interesting. Jorge Ramos, when doing English language media, he did one of the debates with Democrats. He would always talk about Latinx. In Univision in Spanish, he never uses that term.
Right. Because his actual audience in English is Anglo-progressives. It's not actually Hispanics. We have other questions? Clint? Dr. Kevin Stewart of the Austin Institute. What's your question?
So this is related to the topic of the increasing sophistication of the voters, and it's really a factual question, maybe a quick one to answer if you know it, and that is, in the 2020 election, one of the phenomena that we saw across the country is lots of ticket splitting, where people voted one way at the top of the ticket and differently before. In many cases, fewer people voted for Trump at the top of the ticket and voted more for the Republicans below that. Do you know, did we see that with Hispanic and Latino voters? What did that look like there?
I'll give you an example. Georgia. President Trump, if I'm not mistaken, got 37% of the Hispanic vote in Georgia, which is about 7% of the electorate. Pretty good in a very close election. Senator Perdue got 43%. So Senator Perdue, who's not necessarily the most pro-immigrant senator, but still got 43%. That shows that that's a very conservative electorate and very diverse, because in Georgia you have Puerto Ricans and you have Mexican, and so it did happen.
I think if you look at the border counties in Texas, they had sort of this increase for Trump, but a lot of them still voted for local Democratic offices.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think so. I actually don't know the answer on the national level. I know you do, but I know that in South Texas it was a flip to Dr. Menchaca-Bagnulo's point. More Trump voters. Next question. Sorry, go ahead. Yes, sir.
You touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could maybe touch on it a little bit more in depth, which is something I feel like I've seen in general, is that people who would normally vote for Democrats have been really frightened by some of the things they've seen from the radical left, and especially with many of the Latinos who normally vote for Democrats having sort of more traditional conservative beliefs. I was wondering if you thought that sort of campaigning as sort of like Republicans being a defense against radical leftism is something that would work to get some of these Latinos who typically vote Democrat to vote for Republicans.
That's a really good question. So one thing that springs to mind is after the death of George Floyd in Los Angeles, there was a rally that was held by the Latino community, sort of in the spirit of Black Lives Matters. And they talked about police brutality experiences in the Latino community, and they talked about, then they also had speakers from the Black community and the Native community. And at the end, the organizers got a lot of pushback, because people who were affiliated with BLM did not like that the Latinos had talked about their experiences with police brutality. And that was, in my opinion, was a sort of crystallizing moment, because I think so I've been wondering if maybe this sort of elusive phrase, I think Latinos want to be accepted, right? And they want to feel like they're welcomed. So in this example, they're not feeling welcomed by the left, because they're feeling like their experiences of police brutality don't matter. And it's not about them. So that's an example of how, even if you have this sort of left issue that there might be natural affinity for, there's a recoiling that's happening. So even where there's agreement, there's going to be alienation. I think the religiosity also gives a natural alienation. The Latinx is a great example, because I think, like it is colonizing. So I sort of worry about the right sort of wanting to say America's this Anglo-Saxon endeavor and you guys were never here. Okay, but I worry about the left saying, let me tell you, minority, how you're supposed to think about your role in this country, right? And your culture's too gendered, okay? So
The language is too
yes, your
gendered.
language is too gendered. The way you think of yourself is too gendered, and that's colonizing too. So I think you'll find unusual moments that will just organically, you will have this drawing back from the left. Now the question is if the right can pick up that slack.
I think the defund the police was a big thing. I don't think Hispanics like that because we have so many Hispanics in law enforcement. Defund ICE, CBP, the Border Patrol. I dare to say that about 50% of Border Patrol officers are Hispanic.
Yeah.
So when they make those type of comments, they're offending a lot of Hispanics. So I think they see that as extreme left. Another interesting thing that happened during the demonstrations, the violence during the summer of 2020 was something that they don't like. You know, they're coming here because they're tired of the demonstrations they see in Caracas or Managua. They don't want to see that in their cities. They want to have peaceful cities. I saw, and there were Hispanic groups that actually denounced this, statues of Juan Ponce de Leon being pulled down, of Christopher Columbus in California and other places, San Junipero Serra.
Mm-hmm.
You see, this idea, and there are some in the academia, in the extreme left in the academia, that follow this indigenista mentality that's typical in South America, or just trying to say the Spaniards were all awful. The problem is that Hispanics are a mix. So you can't say I'm only Aztec. I'm actually, half Spanish. I don't think in Latin America the majority of people do have that attitude that is so against the Spanish heritage. So when they start seeing those images of burning Catholic or defacing Catholic images, pulling them down, that's a big turnoff.
I want to add one thing, and then I think we've probably got about time for one more question here. So there's a norteño music video by a group called Grupo Intocable, and the song is called Ay Ojitos, and it is an exceptionally entertaining and crass music video. I just want to be really clear about this. But my brother and I joke about it because we talk about this is our grandfather, our Mexican grandfather in heaven, and essentially the music video is pot-bellied Mexican men with pearl snap shirts and blue jeans and taco hats on, and they're in a bar, and there's very attractive bartenders there, and they're indulging in cockfighting, and they've got guns and they're shooting at each other, and there's a norteño band there, and so you think of all like the cultural coding implicit in that kind of scene. In it, and everything, and you can define it almost any way you want, from patriarchy to gender roles to, there's little Guadalupe icons behind the bar for some reason, I don't know why. But this is everything that the left is against in some form, and so I pity the progressive candidate who shows up in Hidalgo County and decides to push. Everything that you see in the Grupo Intocable music video, Ay Ojitos, should be illegal, and you should have 9 genders and not acknowledge any of them. That's a problem. So to that point, yes, sir, go ahead, please.
And that's Tejano music. Just take reggaeton. I mean, they would have to ban what's this Big Bunny? It's a Bad Bunny. If you listen to the lyrics, that is just offends everyone.
Well, may I remind you that Daddy Yankee...
But he's so popular, and he always makes the point that he's very respectful of women until he listens to the lyrics and say, wow.
Until you, well, Daddy Yankee did endorse John McCain in 2008. Yes, yes, he did. Yeah, got some backlash. Sorry, we're getting too niche for you, aren't we? Sorry. Is there one more question? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Betty, and I'm the National Chairwoman of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly.
Hi.
And hi, thank you for having this panel and informing us of some important topics. My question is this. Well, first of all, I think the difference that we've seen with the president in his all-American message, it definitely helped. It definitely helped with the votes. But also he made the Hispanics, and this is something that Dr. Ashley just mentioned a while ago, he made the Hispanics feel welcome. He made the blue collar feel welcome. The workers, which is the Hispanic community, is very prone to this. So how, moving forward, his campaign also campaigned with different coalitions, the Black coalition, the Latino coalition, and throughout the country, I have seen Hispanics come up and tell me, reach out to us as Hispanics. We're proud to be Hispanics. We're Americans, we're America first, but we're proud to be Hispanics. So how can we continue the message without being categorized as identity politics?
I think you have to have Latinos in the infrastructure to have an organic message. So to be able to finesse the differences between Cubans and the Intocable, bar scene, that's going to come from someone who has lived that life. To finesse the differences between maybe the political pedigrees that people might have and the working class, you're going to have people who have lived that life. And so if you want to continue the kind of energy that you're saying, you've got to move people who have lived this way up into the ranks so that they can speak publicly and so that they can advise internally on what to do. And when you see yourself represented in something, and this is one thing I think identity politics gets right, even if they do it in a way that is too ham-fisted, and it's that ham-fistedness I think you want to avoid, is seeing yourself represented in something because you're working on it, and people who remind you of yourself are working on it. That's what I would say needs to happen, and that hasn't happened in the Democratic Party. In the Democratic Party, Castro said after the election, look, Biden and the Democrats failed to reach Latinos, in part because they don't have any Latinos in these important public-facing or institutional positions. And the Republican Party actually does already. And I think the more that they do, the better it will be.
Alfonso, I'll let you have the last word on the question, and then we'll close it out.
I don't know if I agree, because I think in terms of faces in the campaign, they had many. They were better funded in terms of Hispanic efforts. I think at the end is the message. I mean, I think engagement is fundamental. We have to show up. What I would say is, I think we need Hispanic conservative leaders leading. Show the Republican Party, show the conservative movement that you're going to the community and talking about the issue. So you're going to talk about family leave. You're going to a church and talking about the right to life. You're going to a church and talking about why it's a crazy idea to have somebody who's biologically male play in female sports. I think if they see Hispanic leaders engaging the community, talking about ideas, they're going to realize that that's the way to go, and they're going to listen to us and incorporate us. I think throughout the years and through decades now, we've had some incredible Hispanic Republican leaders. I mean, I see Massey, I see Rafa. We also have to think of a little bit of succession planning. So I'm pointing here at Abraham Enriquez, who has started the Bienvenido initiative here in Texas. A lot of these people come from Texas. And Texas, I think, leads the way. It makes perfect sense because you've really incorporated Hispanics into what Texas is. And I think that you can lead. We need younger Hispanics activated, going to the community, talking about the issues. It's not enough to do a Hispanic event. I hate when I get a call from the GOP. Well, they don't call me anymore. But they call and they say, let's do a Hispanic event. What do you mean by a Hispanic event?
But when TPPF called you to do a Hispanic event.
Well, no, but to me, a Hispanic event is you talk to Hispanics about issues, but not to do a Hispanic event where you're going to have tacos, and you talk about the issues. You really engage them, because a lot of time the approach is focused on, on superficial aspects of culture. I'm not saying that you don't have, if you're doing an event with Puerto Ricans, you don't have a salsa band or whatever. That's great. But if it's all of that and there's no substance, you're not talking about the issues, to me it's meaningless. We have to persuade, and I think that's the way forward.
Thank you very much. That brings the Q&A section to an end. I'll close with this. At 909 Juarez Street in Laredo, just near downtown, for those of you who know Laredo, is not a wealthy neighborhood, but there's a small white house there that was built by hand by a particular individual over the course of about 25 years. This man worked only as a taxi driver, a vegetable picker, and an itinerant fruit vendor in Laredo and around the country. And yet this individual ended up marrying and staying married to the same woman his entire life. He actually married an illegal immigrant from Mexico. He himself, although a native-born Texan, spoke only Spanish his entire life. She gave him 13 children, 11 of whom lived, all of whom were baptized, and the 11 were raised in the faith and ended up good people. This gentleman lived poor but never felt poor, worked hard, and left a legacy that is so powerful. This Tomas Hidrogo was his name, my great-grandfather, after whom my 5-year-old son Thomas is named, carrying on that legacy. And I would submit that him and people like him throughout American history have been the substance and stuff of the Hispanic presence in America, and not only doing well for themselves, but for the country in which they live, and long may it continue. In the spirit of Jose de la Luz Saints, Viva Washington. Thanks so much. I am really appreciative of both of you. Thank you.